Journalism Institute, which is sponsoring this event today. Obviously, this was a very expensive election, the most expensive in history, correct? And the question is, who paid for it, right? So we have a great panel of experts here today to help us decipher the election, look into the money and where all those donations came from, where they went, and looking forward, what might happen afterward. What will Congress do? Will they do anything about the amount of money pouring into the elections, or will they let it, let the gates open and have more out there? Let me introduce the panel. Sheila Krumholz, excuse me, apologize. On my left here, Executive Director of the Center for Responsive Politics and my favorite money and politics site, opensecrets.org. Fred Wertheimer, over here on my right, President of Democracy 21, a longtime advocate of overhauling campaign finance laws, and one of my favorite go-to guys to quote my own newspaper. Trevor Potter here to my right, the former chairman of the Federal Elections Commission and president of the Campaign Legal Center, also counsel for Stephen Colbert's America for a Better Tomorrow super-PAC. Or the former, I guess. Jonathan Salant on my left here is a money and politics reporter for Bloomberg News and a former president of the National Press Club. We're going to start out this morning with Sheila, who has a presentation for us.
Thank you, and thanks to the Press Club and all of you for your interest. So I'm just going to review some of the key data, trends, and highlights from this cycle, and hope that that is a good place to launch the rest of the discussion about its impact and significance. Oh, yes, thanks.
I want to hear your presentation.
Yes, okay, that's better. All right, so how much did it cost? This chart gives the comparison over time, 1998 to 2012. $6 billion is our estimate for how much this cycle will cost. We don't have final figures yet. In fact, we won't until they come in following the year-end filing next January. But this will be updated following Thursday's filing of post-general reports, and then again once we have all of the data in next year. Of course, as you can see, and as you know, there's always kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back trajectory here to the federal election spending because of the extraordinary resources that are expended with each presidential election cycle. Over time, though, you can see a continued substantial growth with a 70% increase in spending from 2000 to 2008 alone. In 2000, candidates, parties, and outside groups that focused on federal elections spent just about $3 billion. In 2004, more than $4 billion. In 2008, nearly $5.3 billion. So in the next week or two, we'll update our prediction for total spending. We're pretty confident that it remains at $6 billion. What is absolutely certain is that in this cycle, the outside money will make up a much larger portion of the funds than ever before. This is kind of a strange chart, but this shows the comparison over time through December 3rd of each cycle going back in time. And these are outside spending figures excluding party committees. So super PACs in cycles that had them, independent expenditures, communication costs, electioneering communications. And what this shows is, again, not much activity from 90 to 2002, but in 2004, it leapt to 190 million. In 2008, nearly 300 million, keeping level in 2010, which is holding steady with the presidential cycle. And then in 2012, with nearly 1.1 billion spent so far, independent expenditures are exploding. Here's another way to look at that outside spending. But when you look at these comparisons over time, you'll see it includes other kinds of outside money that were prevalent in years past. And so you see more of a continuity. The purple bars represent national party soft money spending, and you can see that grow through the 90s, especially in 2000 and 2002, the last call at the soft money bar, before BICRA kicked in. And then the outside activity shifts to federally focused 527s. Those are the orange bars, especially in 2004. You all remember Swift Boat, Veterans for Truth. But continuing through this cycle. The big story here, obviously, is still the growth in independent expenditures, starting in 2004, but just skyrocketing in 2012. There's one caveat here. The light blue bar on the very last, on 2012, on the last column, represents unreported ads referencing candidates. And this is shown at a mere $100 million. That's almost certainly doubled at least. But more importantly, you should understand that this money has been spent, but not reported, on quote-unquote issue ads for years, just not to the degree we're seeing now in 2012. So this is an underreporting of that kind of money for previous cycles. Looking at it by type of spender, I want to note that this shows super PACs at $680 million. But yesterday we found a number of duplicates in the 24-hour report, so I have to beg your pardon, because you want this to be accurate, as do we. But we need to carefully examine each of those expenditures to match it up to the initial report, because the numbers do not match. So it'll show the same transaction but show a different amount, and so we need to verify whether or not those are the same. So the actual figure that we have calculated yesterday is $643 million for super PACs rather than $680. And that should be changed on our site momentarily, but these figures are updated hourly on our site. So clearly they change daily, if not more frequently. Although they're not changing so much anymore. But as a reporter, as you're looking at the quarterlies, the monthlies, the pre-general, the post-general, the 24-hour reports, you have to look carefully to reconcile these figures so that you're not double counting. Outside spending by race, you can see at a glance that the vast majority of the outside spending was directed at the presidential cycle. The color bar at the top gives you the at-a-glance view. Blue is presidential, $682 million so far. Green is the Senate with $352 million, and gold is the House with $348 million. Specifically in Congress, the top targets were, in order, Virginia Senate, $50 million, including party committees, mostly directed against Tim Kaine. Wisconsin Senate, $42 million, mostly against Tommy Thompson. Ohio Senate, $36.9 million, mostly against Sherrod Brown. Indiana Senate, $33 million, split fairly evenly against Richard Murdoch and Joe Donnelly, with a pinch at $1.7 million thrown in against Lugar for good measure. So on top of having to raise an average of $1.2 million so far for House candidates, winning House candidates, and $9.5 million so far in the Senate, can you imagine having to withstand the barrage of ads and other spending these additional sums will buy? Outside spending by candidate, when we're looking at this spending by candidate, you can see at a glance the largest chunk of the money was spent against Democrats, 46.4%. That's the pink section of the pie, followed by 29.6% spent against Republicans, 16.9% spent for Republicans, and 7% spent for Democrats. We can't add up the against Democrats and for Republicans, because some of that, or against Republicans and for Democrats, because some of that against Republicans was spent by other Republicans in the primary. So we really do have to break it down in this way. Again, the top targets were Obama, Romney, Gingrich, Kaine, Santorum, Tommy Thompson. 20 million. All of these 6 candidates were on the receiving end of a barrage of 20 million or more, again, including party outside spending. And when we look at it by group, first, excluding party committees, when we look at the bottom pie chart by viewpoint, again, the money is shown overwhelmingly conservative, 68.7% spent by conservative organizations. When looking at the groups by disclosure, the top pie chart, the original sources of the money are mostly hidden, either fully or partially. 60% of the outside non-party spending has incomplete disclosure, and about 30% had absolutely no disclosure at all. So less than 40% of the money is fully disclosed. Voters were hamstrung. They were carpet-bombed with these ads, often deceptive, negative advertising, yet had one hand tied behind their backs because of the lack of disclosure, which meant they couldn't consider the source of the ads or know what ulterior motives drove them to sponsor political ads. Even for registered super PACs, I should emphasize, some of the PACs have not disclosed their donors as they should. So even for a few super PACs, we're denoting them as having partial or even no disclosure because several have used have taken in all of their money from non-disclosing non-disclosing 501c nonprofits, or have taken substantial funds from shell corporations, apparent shell corporations, to hide the true identity of the original donors. Another issue with super PACs is that they're ostensibly independent, but in practice that's not entirely the case. Of the more than 1,100 super PACs registered, 111 are single candidate super PACs that spent $286 million, or 43% of all super PAC money, focused on just one candidate, raising the question, are these new leadership PACs? Will everyone soon have one? In 2014, will this be the new vehicle of choice used to leverage deep pockets to influence elections in the future? Earlier in the year, we conducted a study with Campaign Legal Center and Democracy 21 and found that super PACs for presidential candidates took in huge sums from individuals who gave the legal limit to the candidate's campaign. In fact, during 2011, 84% of Restore Our Future's donors had also given the legal maximum to Romney's campaign. So it amounts to kind of making a pit stop in terms of hard money to the candidate on the way to giving much larger sums to the super PAC. And again, raising the question whether these are, in fact, shadow candidate committees set up to evade the contribution limits. Non-disclosing outside spending groups. For non-disclosing groups, the viewpoint is, again, overwhelmingly conservative, rising to 85%, and running 69% against Democrats, the pink part of the pie. In the second chart, blue is conservative. You need to flip that. And gold is liberal. And now is the logical place to repeat that this is only what's reported to the Federal Election Commission. There is another likely $200 million or more that was spent on issue ads identifying a federal candidate by nonprofits that never reported that spending. Groups like the Wesleyan Media Project have reported on much of this money, and additionally groups like CRP have been digging into the 990s and 1024 tax forms, and we found an additional $150 million going to political nonprofits back in 2010. Of course, there's this lag in our ability to view these forms. And more generally found a lot of churning back and forth between these organizations, something that one tax expert said raises suspicions of money laundering. In terms of the presidential race, let me just quickly wrap up here. We expect both campaigns will include about $1.2 billion each in spending, counting campaigns, parties, the RNC, DNC, and outside groups. Once we see the final numbers, outside spending will be about 12% or so for Obama and nearly 33% for Romney. Current spending is already at over $2 billion, as shown here. Add in the other GOP candidates, outside spending on them, the more than $35 million for the conventions, more than $100 million for the host committees, and we predict presidential spending all told will come to about $2.6 to $2.8 billion, perhaps matching the total spent in 2008, which is extraordinary given what a wide open race that was. So that is it for my presentation. I hope that gives a starting point for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we make this presentation? This is going to be available on your website.
Sure,
We'll also make the video of this available on the Press Club website as well for those. It's funny to think about all this money spent, and we still have Barack Obama as president. The Dems still control the Senate, the Republicans the House. $6 billion spent.
Michael Melvin had a really good comment about that. He said it was an arms race fought to a standstill.
Yeah. I'm turning the time over to Fred, who will speak next.
Thanks. I'm going to focus my comments on super PACs and start out with one fact that I think gives us a sense of what the super PACs really are about. There are more than 300 million people in this country, according to the last census. According to Open Secrets, just 102 individuals gave more than 40% of the total amount of money given to super PACs at an average contribution of $2.6 million per donor. Now, there were various stories after the election about how maybe super PACs weren't that big a problem and didn't have that much influence, mainly because Romney lost and the Democrats picked up seats in the Senate. I would maintain that that argument misses the real issue here, because the real danger of super PACs is the fact that they provide potential corrupting influence for their big donors over government decisions. And that's true regardless of who wins the elections. As was just mentioned, the Democrats won the White House, they control the Senate. The Republicans control the House and have a veto power in the Senate. But the donors to super PACs that supported both sides basically purchased a premium seat at the table in Washington when it comes to government decisions in the future. The super PACs turned out to be a political sandbox for the millionaires and billionaires. They were the dominant force in super PACs, and they will be seen and heard from in Washington in the years to come. The parties and their office holders will be available to these donors because of the support they provided and because they are going to be solicited for the future. Super PAC problem is real and it's here to stay. There were a couple of articles yesterday that kind of demonstrated this. Peter Stone had an article in Huffington Post about Sheldon Adelson, and it made a couple of salient points. The first point it made was that they reported he gave closer to $150 million than $100 million he had been talking about to influence this election. The article also stated that Adelson would be in Washington soon, that he arranged meetings on the Hill, and that one of the issues he wanted to talk about, and I will quote, possible changes to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the anti-bribery law that undergirds one federal probe into his casino network. Ken Vogel had an article in Politico that pointed out that presidential hopefuls in 2016 are already chasing mega donors. 3 potential Republican candidates each met separately with Sheldon Adelson recently. This system, it's very important to realize, is just beginning. 2012 was kind of spring training for what we're going to see happen here. And what's instructive in understanding that is the history of soft money, unlimited contributions to the political parties. In 1988, the total combined unlimited contributions to the Democratic and Republican national parties was $45 million. By 2000, it had grown to $500 million, a tenfold increase over 12 years. Now we're starting out with roughly $650 billion for super PACs, a substantial amount for nonprofits. That's going to be a growth industry. Those folks are not going away. The idea that this didn't have much influence so that we're not going to be seeing them in the future is simply not realistic. In fact, we're going to see an arms race. We're going to see Republicans and Democrats chasing this money in the future, and we're going to face, federal candidates are going to face more and more unlimited spending based on unlimited contributions. One other interesting development we have seen is the idea of super PACs becoming lobbyists. Now just picture that scene. The super PAC comes in to lobby a member of Congress, makes their case for an important policy position, and an implicit threat sitting there is that if you don't support our position, you could face unlimited spending by what I like to call these political drones, bombarding your race with millions of dollars. That is implicit in the whole super PAC system. And when you turn the super PAC into a lobbying force, you're making almost a direct connection in the corrupting influence problem that underlies the fundamental problem with super PACs. Some of the most interesting comments about super PACs were made by Federal Circuit Court Judge Richard Posner, who's from the 7th Circuit, a conservative judge considered by many observers to be the most influential judge that is not sitting on the Supreme Court. He said two things. I mean, the Supreme Court in the Buckley case had said that unlimited contributions to candidates, that system is an inherently corrupt system for obvious reasons. Judge Posner adds, it's difficult to see what practical difference there is between super PAC donations and direct campaign donations from a corruption standpoint. He then went on to say about the Citizens United decision, our political system is pervasively corrupt due to our Supreme Court taking away campaign contribution restrictions on the basis of the First Amendment. And there he was talking about campaign contribution limits on super PACs. So this is what we're going to face going into the future. We've got a corrupt campaign finance system. That money is going to increase until we do something about it. We can't eliminate truly independent super PACs, but there are important steps that can be taken to curb the role of super PACs within the parameters of that decision. The Empowering Citizens Act, introduced in the House by Representatives David Price and Chris Van Hollen, includes the first comprehensive proposal in Congress to strengthen and override the ineffectual coordination regulations adopted by the FEC. Now, Sheila was talking about these candidate-specific super PACs that only support one candidate or primarily support one candidate. This legislation has provisions in it that will define those kinds of super PACs as coordinated to the campaign, which they are. They're arms of the campaigns. And as Sheila was pointing out, they're really there to evade the contribution limits. I believe you can define in a very effective way, there is no perfection, but you can define in an effective way organizations like Restore Our Future, which supported Romney, and Priorities USA that supported Obama, out of existence. This legislation also strengthens the rules prohibiting coordination between candidates and other outside spending groups. It prohibits federal candidates and their agents from raising any money for super PACs. And it strengthens the ability to, for parties to work with their candidates to respond to outside spending, but it does it without increasing party contribution limits, which we strongly oppose. A couple today can give $120,000 to a national party committee over a 2-year period. Increasing the already large amounts that wealthy individuals can give to parties will only increase the influence of a minuscule percentage of individuals in this country, and that will come at the expense of all other citizens. The Empowering Citizens Act also has another main component, and that is to create a new system of matching small contributions with multiple public funds. It's modeled after the successful system that is used in New York City. It would greatly increase the importance of small contributions for candidates and thereby diminish the importance of super PACs. And it will allow candidates to have a new way of raising very substantial funds for their campaigns, to compete with their candidates and to respond to super PAC funding. So we've got a big problem on our hands, a problem that's going to get worse until we start taking steps to address it. There are things that can be done, and our organization will be working very hard to build support for the Empowering Citizens Act. Thank you. Trevor?
Thank you, Fred. Now to, for a different perspective, the guy who ran a super PAC last time, actually, Trevor Potter.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Before I dive into what I want to talk about, I'll just add one thing to something that Fred just commented on, which is the drumbeat to raise the contribution limits. The calculations I've seen are that if, under current law, individuals may give only up to $2,500 to a candidate per election. And the calculation I've seen is if you look at how many people reach that threshold, this is not giving the 110 that Fred referred to as the aggregate limit, but just a single contribution of $2,500, the maximum, to a candidate. You will see that based on the FEC records, 0.05% of 1% of Americans, so 5% of 1%, actually gave the $2,500. So when people are talking about raising the contribution limits, Fred referred to the number of people who can give that as minuscule. Well, given the current political debate about the 1% or the 2%, here you are talking about a tiny fraction of the 1% who even now currently reach the maximum number. So you really are talking about empowering a very, very small percentage of a small percentage if you look at raising those limits. Now, I found the charts from the Center for Responsive Politics fascinating, as always. I think we're all indebted to the Center for all the work it does in translating this information and those reports. The one I'd like to focus on for a moment is the non-disclosed funding aspect. You may recall that when Citizens United came out, there was one section of the opinion that surprisingly had 8 justices in support, everyone but Justice Thomas. And that was the section on disclosure, because the case had started as a disclosure case. And the plaintiffs had said, we don't think we should have to disclose our donors because this is not actually a campaign communication. So when it was all finished and the court had turned the case on its head and decided that corporations could spend money in elections, they then still had to reach the question of, well, do corporations like Citizens United have to disclose who their funders are? 8-1, the court says, yes, the law requires it, and it's a good thing. The good thing is the court describes it, and I'll quote here, the First Amendment protects political speech, and disclosure permits citizens and shareholders to react to the speech of corporate entities in a proper way. This transparency enables the electorate to make informed decisions and give proper weight to different speakers and messages. So there are 2 values there. One, shareholders know how their money is being spent, and they can say something about it to the corporation. And secondly, voters know who is speaking. And the court goes on to say that's important because where the money comes from is part of the context that informs what voters hear in the message. So the court has said disclosure is good, but they went beyond that. They said, don't worry about all this corporate money because we're going to have disclosure. Quote, a campaign finance system that pairs corporate independent expenditures with effective disclosure has not existed before today, 2010. So what's going on there? The court is saying that it reads the law, McCain-Feingold, to require disclosure of the sources of campaign advertising. And they're clear, this isn't some narrow express advocacy test. This is advertising about candidates during the election, roughly the electioneering communication standard in McCain-Feingold, plus any independent expenditures. And the court is thinking that one of 2 things is going to happen. Either, since in Citizens United we didn't have super PACs yet and the court wasn't talking about super PACs, they're assuming that a corporation is going to spend money to talk about a candidate, and the bottom of the ad it's going to say, paid for by Microsoft. So you're going to know who the ads come from because they're going to do it directly. Or in the case of a group like Citizens United, which was a C4, the corporation is going to be required by the existing law to disclose its funders. So you jump forward to the election we've just seen, the numbers that Sheila has just shown us. where we're looking at $350 million or some of spending, the joys of not the Colbert Super PAC, but the Colbert C4, Americans for a Better Tomorrow, SHHH, as in shh. And what Colbert was doing there and what donors across the spectrum were doing is saying, you know, I could give to a super PAC, but that reports to the FEC and it has to disclose its donors, and unless I create a shell corporation to stick the money in, people are going to know it's me, and if I create a shell, maybe some smart person in the press is going to figure out it is a shell, and then there'll be lots of noise about it. Why not just give to one of these groups that doesn't disclose its donors to the IRS and doesn't disclose its donors to the FEC when it reports that it's doing TV and radio spending, and nobody will know I gave. I don't have to have a shell corporation for that. And that's what was going on. The Colbert one was directly modeled on American Crossroads, which, it's useful to remember, started as a super PAC. In fact, there was a big press conference where they said, we're going to be fully transparent. This is not secret money. We believe in the value of disclosure. Everyone's going to know where our money is coming from. That lasted until the end of the first reporting period, where they didn't have much money, and they scrambled around to figure out why they weren't doing what they thought they could do, and they discovered that donors were interested in anonymity. So they then created American Crossroads GPS, and we're off to the races with these two pockets of the same coat. That's the model that we've seen. So the question arises, why did the court get it wrong in Citizens United? Why did they think we were going to have full disclosure? The short answer is that they were reading the statute, which is not a bad thing to do, but they were unaware of what the Federal Election Commission had done to the statute. The law itself specifies that disclosure is required of all contributions of $1,000 or more to a group running an electioneering communication. Mentions a candidate within 30 days of the primary, 60 of the general. That still leaves the issue ad space in the summer, but the principal ads were covered by that. What happened is that in 2007, the Federal Election Commission changed the statute. They added a provision that said that when it says contributors, it really means only people, entities, who gave money, quote, for the purpose of furthering election communications. And since then, the three Republican commissioners have said it doesn't mean just generally for the purpose of electioneering communications, but for the purpose of paying for the electioneering communication that is being run. So we went from a broad statute that covered everyone, and every organization that ran an electioneering communication ad either disclosed all their donors over 1,000 or established under the law a separate fund, paid for it out of that fund, and only disclosed the people who gave to that fund. That was the statute. To this FEC statute that essentially guts it, the regulation. There have been attempts since then, that was 2007. The commissioners were largely replaced in 2008, and there has been a deadlock and a fight amongst the commissioners since then, with the Democrats arguing that this standard was a mistake, that the record shows it provides inadequate disclosure, in fact, almost no disclosure, because the groups that run these ads, now where it says who are the funders, report nobody designated their money for this ad, so we don't have anything to disclose. That's where that $350 million comes from. There was a lawsuit this year, momentarily a bright moment on the horizon. Fred's group, Democracy 21, and the Campaign Legal Center represented Congressman Van Hollen, who said the FEC is failing to accurately enforce the statute. They have created a regulation out of whole cloth that isn't what Congress said. Congress could have put in a purpose requirement and didn't, and the court should throw out the regulation and tell the FEC to enforce the statute as written. And the district judge agreed and said that the FEC had been arbitrary and capricious in rewriting the statute. Unfortunately, the circuit court said it's more complicated than that. We're not sure what the regulation actually means. We need to go back to the FEC and get clarification, or at least give them the opportunity to clarify. So the regulation that I think is the source of these problems is still in effect. So where do we go from here? There are two things. First, the FEC itself clearly could change its regulation. And the question is, will it do so? The answer is not, as long as we have the current 3 Republican commissioners there who have blocked every attempt to even have a rulemaking on this issue. And their position appears to be that since Congress doesn't have enough votes in the Senate to close down a filibuster on a proposed broader disclosure provision called the Disclose Act, then the FEC shouldn't do anything about enforcing the existing law as written either, and should just say that there's a government-wide deadlock on the subject. Now, that could be changed. There are currently, of the 6 commissioners, 5 of them are on expired terms, meaning they're there pending a presidential nomination and confirmation of their successors. So the easiest way to deal with this is to have new commissioners who believe the law should be enforced as written, which conveniently is actually up to the president. So he can, under the Constitution, and is expected to make nominations for the Senate to then advise and consent on. That'd be the short way to do it. The longer way to do it, obviously, is for Congress to go in, broaden the disclosure requirements, state that it really meant what it said in the existing ones. But the good news on all this is we do not have a constitutional problem. We have a very clear Supreme Court statement that disclosure is expected as well as a good thing for our democracy.
Thank you. We now have the best in the business right now who looked at campaign contributions. Turn over to Jonathan Salant.
Thank you. Let me add a couple of thoughts about the just concluded election first. First, this was the first privately funded presidential election since Watergate. That was, Tom, that was before you were born, and Fred was still working on campaign finance at that time. The 1976 new law came in matching funds for presidential campaigns, both for the primary and then for the general election. The government would pay the entire cost of the general election for each candidate if they agreed only to spend that type of money. Until 2000, every nominee had taken federal funds for both the primary and the general. 2000, President Bush became the first nominee not to take federal funds for the primary because you could raise much more money privately. And since then, Fred and other reformers have been working on trying to increase that matching fund list so you could get more money. 2004, both nominees didn't take money for the primary. In 2008, President Obama became the first general election candidate not to take money and raise a lot more money on his own than McCain took for the federal money. And of course, this year, neither Obama nor Romney took the federal money. One of the reasons that contributed to a lot of the money being spent in the presidential race. Also, on the super PACs, we saw the super PACs being a lifeline to some candidates. Newt Gingrich wouldn't have lasted had it not been for Sheila Krumholz and his wife, who gave $20 million to a super PAC. Rick Santorum would not have lasted, not been forced to freeze giving millions of dollars to a super PAC. So it helped some of these candidates who couldn't raise money outside stay in the race much longer than normally. And in fact, it prolonged the race, which could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your opinion of it. The other thing that had struck me on some of this is 2010 was always described as a practice run for 2012. And there was a lot of money dumped into a lot of congressional races at the last minute. And you had people, Dina Titus of Nevada comes to mind, Alan Grayson of Florida, 2 people who had outraised their opponent 2-to-1, 3-to-1. And all of a sudden, all this outside money from people and groups we never heard of narrowed the gap, and these people lost in the 2010 wave election. This time around, the Democrats came up with their own super PACs. There was a majority PAC in the Senate and House majority PAC in the House. And if you look at Sheila's website, a lot of that kept the Democrats competitive in some of these races where there was a lot of the outside spending money. Okay, so now where do we get the money from? Well, the good news, while we still don't know a lot of where a lot of the money came from, we will get to know where some of that money comes from. All these nonprofits have to file 990 forms, which we alluded to earlier, and it'll be a year or 2 later, but they will file forms, and sometimes they actually disclose who is funding them. or another 990 another group will file and say, I gave to this group. We learned that the pharmaceutical industry, for example, funded a couple of these nonprofit groups that were running ads. In fact, not only were they running ads, but they were running ads that elected lawmakers who then voted against the business interests of the pharmaceutical industry. We found companies. The Center for Political Accountability has been lobbying companies to disclose their donors. So we now know that Prudential Financial, for example, is a multi-million-dollar donor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which, by the way, in this election had a one-loss record rivaling that of the 1962 Mets. One game better after 50 games. So there's a chance to learn who some of these companies are. And one of the big emphasis on disclosure in the Disclose Act is that corporations don't want to be known because they have customers on both sides of the political spectrum. Target Corporation in 2010 gave money to a business group that then endorsed an anti-gay rights candidate for governor, and the gay community was really pissed at Target, and there was talk of boycotts. So companies are really gun-shy. This time around, I think only Chevron Corporation, of all the big companies, actually gave to a super-PAC. And most companies themselves stay out of presidential races as well. So you've got, but by having this disclosure, that's one of the reasons, I guess, one way to rein in some of the spending, because a lot of the corporations, the ones who were behind the Citizens United decision, don't want their identities to be known. We don't know, for example, who funded the Chamber campaign of $36 million that they spent officially, and the whatever much they spent on ads that weren't disclosed and other expenditures that weren't disclosed. If it's a couple of corporations, their stockholders and their companies might be really annoyed, and they're not going to give that type of money last time around. We found, for example, the Chamber was running all these anti-healthcare ads thanks to $75 million from the healthcare industry, which we found out much later after that. The other thing to look for, Thursday is the next big filing deadline. We'll know how much Obama and Romney spent in the closing days of their campaign. We'll know if there's any last-minute spending by any candidates. We'll also know if there's money left over. John Kerry in 2004 was criticized for having like $5 or $10 million left in the bank in what could have been a tight election. We found out even in October before the election, Mitt Romney and his people were sitting on a lot of money. Obama had sent it all out to the Obama Democratic National Committee had sending this money all the way out to the states. Democratic National Committee had 2 or 3 month head start in organizing in key battleground states. The Republican National Committee had this huge bank balance in the middle of October. The Democratic National Committee already sent their money out. So one of the things I'd like to know is whether there's all this money left over. And if there is, what's that going to be used for? Romney's paid bonuses to his staff after the convention, and even paid some bonuses right before the election. Even some of the losing candidates, did they have leftover money and then decided to share it with their staff members, the ones who ran those campaigns, losing campaigns? And the other thing to look at is, the fundraising never ends. Fred mentioned that some of the people are meeting with Allison for 2016, but just a couple of days, even before the election, some of these members-elect, even before they were members-elect, set up what are called leadership PACs. Leadership PACs are another fundraising vehicle. You can give $5,000, $2,500 for the general, $2,500 for the primary to a candidate. You can give an extra $5,000 a year to a leadership PAC. If you're running for Senate, your top contributor of $5,000 can also give you another $30,000. And these leadership PACs, the vehicle Barack Obama used before he ran for president, Mitt Romney used before he ran for president, lets you travel around the country, raise your profile, and help other members. One of the reasons, and story I had done many years ago, when Tom DeLay was under fire for alleged money laundering, and the Republican conference stuck with him, and they even changed the rules at one point so he wouldn't have to step down if he was indicted. Well, almost every member of the caucus owed their victory in part because Tom DeLay's leadership PAC had given him a lot of money as they were running. First run for office, he helps you. You're then in a tough race, you get help from other candidates. So it helps build up these chits. And John Boehner, if you look at the Sheila site, John Boehner was the biggest spender in 2012, even though he had virtually no opposition and was never threatened. All that money went to help other candidates, and they remember that. And when there's an election for speaker, even if somebody's challenging him, a lot of those people are likely to stand by him because they owe their seats and their support to him.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're going to turn to questions now. We have a microphone here in a second. I'm going to start off, though, if I may, Sheila, with a question for you. Will we ever know, with shell companies, all these nonprofits out there, you mentioned, Jonathan mentioned the 990s we can look at, but will we ever know where some of this funding came from this campaign?
No, for those persistent anti-disclosure interests, if they refuse to talk, I think it's typical that over time somebody says something to somebody, like something leaks out.
Let's hope.
But no, if they are disciplined and obstinate, I don't think, short of, I don't think we will know necessarily where some of the Shell Corporation money has come from.
Trevor?
I think there's absolutely no reason we'll know at all. These groups were largely set up for the purpose of avoiding disclosure. What's interesting here is they went so far when the judge temporarily ruled that the people who funded electioneering communications had to disclose their donors. The groups that were running electioneering communications, which is to say a sort of phony issue ad that mentions a candidate, they all stopped running those communications rather than have to disclose their donors. Now, they have good lawyers, so what they said was, the judges only said we have to disclose the funders of electioneering communications. Technically, if we say in the ad, which we never have done before, vote for, vote against a candidate, then it's no longer defined as an electioneering communication. It's something called an independent expenditure. That's a different provision of the act. The judge hasn't ruled on that. And all these groups shifted and literally edited the copy to add vote for, vote against at the end as a way of avoiding the disclosure requirement. Then when the D.C. Circuit said the judge's opinion was stayed and they didn't have to disclose their funders of electioneering communication, they went right back to running electioneering communications. So, they're focused on not disclosing their donors. They don't have to publicly. The forms they file with the IRS have a schedule for disclosing donors, but that's a confidential schedule, and the IRS is not supposed to release it. So unless somebody makes a clerical error at the IRS, we're not going to see it. The other battleground on disclosure has been the Securities and Exchange Commission. There is currently a rulemaking underway there, and they are looking at the possibility of requiring public companies to disclose their political expenses to their shareholders. Now, that's only public companies, and there's no guarantee that'll happen. That would be consistent with what the Supreme Court said in Citizens United and would give us a window that we don't currently have, but there's no sign at all that would be retroactive.
Let me add one other thing. There was a consensus in this country for more than 3 decades among Democrats and Republicans that disclosure was the baseline campaign finance law that we should have. In 2000, when we had a problem with 527 organizations who were spending money in federal elections but not disclosing, Congress moved very quickly to pass disclosure laws, a new disclosure law to close that loophole. In the Senate, 48 Republicans and 44 Democrats voted for disclosure. 10 years later, in 2010, not a single Republican voted for disclosure. And what happened was we had the Citizens United decision. Some key Republicans, including led by Senator McConnell, saw a political advantage for Republicans because Karl Rove had moved very quickly in 2010 to create the crossroad groups. And all of a sudden, Republicans in Congress, as a group, abandoned an idea that they had not only supported, but they had basically used to argue against other campaign finance provisions like contribution limits or public financing or anything else, by saying that the real answer here is full disclosure and timely disclosure. So somehow we have got to break through that and get back to a situation where a sufficient number of Republicans do what they would normally do under ordinary circumstances and support disclosure, and efforts were made in 2010 and 2012 to reach out to Republicans in Congress, to ask them what changes they wanted in the Disclose Act, to ask if they would negotiate, and no one would step forward. Now, in this Congress, that same effort is going to be made to try to find Republicans who do want to come back to where they used to be, and to try to see if some Republicans will negotiate with Democrats a new disclosure bill that can get sufficient bipartisan support.
And some of it is, even some of the spending is not disclosed, even though the law says if you mention a federal candidate a certain number before an election, there are groups, and we found them in 2010 by looking at television records, and even if you look at some of the television records 2012, there are ads that were never disclosed to the Federal Election Commission. And some of these groups say, well, it doesn't affect them. They weren't political ads, even though they basically said, call your congressman and tell him or her that they should do this or they shouldn't do this. So not only do we not know who's funding some of these ads, we don't even know who's running some of these ads.
We'll have to say, though, in this election cycle, we did have the wonderful part of the FCC actually saying the public file has to be online. That was the first time. You used to have to drive to television stations and check their public file, right?
Well, and you still do for those that are outside of that 50 market.
You're right, yeah. The
Base.
top 50 market, right?
Yeah.
Let's open this up to questions. Please ask you identify yourself. If you have to ask a question, we have a microphone, I think, right over there. Anyone have a question in the audience? We have none. No, we have one. Okay, there we go.
My name is Michael Beckel. I work at the Center for Public Integrity, and I just wanted to follow up on going forward. How likely do you think it is that some Republicans might come on board with new disclosure requirements, maybe trading or increasing campaign contributions? And the contribution limit question, do you think, where do you draw that line? How do you write that equation, or are the risks too great to try to, how do you find common ground?
It's a great question. Trevor, you want to start off with that one, or Fred?
I'm looking at Fred because he mentioned that he thinks that there are opportunities now on the Hill.
Well, we're looking for opportunities on the Hill. We don't know the answer to that. We know that someone like Senator Murkowski has made very clear that she supports disclosure. Whether that will lead to engaging in discussions, I don't know. We're quite confident that if and when we do get discussions and we do get close on disclosure, the issue of increasing contribution limits will be raised. That's what happened in the McCain-Feingold fight, and an agreement was reached that raised them to a reasonable level that wasn't worrisome. Now, we start off with Republican leaders who have said we ought to repeal the contribution limits. And that, they argue that would create disclosure because the money would go to the candidates and parties. They argue that would create accountability because you know the parties and candidates spending it. They leave out the third factor, which it would also create a system of legalized bribery, pure legalized bribery. So then you go to the question of increasing contribution limits. If you increase party limits, for example, too high, or take off the aggregate limits, you're headed back, you're turning hard money into soft money, and you're creating the same kinds of problems that come from very large contributions. The late Senator Russell Long once defined the issue very simply. He said the difference between a large contribution and a bribe is a hairline's difference. So it will come on the table when we get to the point of having negotiations. We will strongly resist increasing contribution limits for candidates and parties. If you took off the aggregate limit, for example, you would have individuals who could give $1 million to a party. So there's in our view, great dangers involved in starting to increase contribution limits. I do think sooner or later we are going to get opportunities for disclosure. And when that happens, the question will be what kind of price, and at least for our organizations, we're not prepared to pay a high price for disclosure when it comes to political money that can buy corrupting influence.
Anyone else want to respond to the question? Trevor?
Oh, I think Fred's right in his earlier comments in saying that up until 2010, disclosure was sort of the minimum agreed upon norm in campaign finance law. The Democrats wanted much more than disclosure. The Republicans said we could do just with disclosure, but nobody suggested that we shouldn't have disclosure. I think what we saw was probably an aberration, which is a brief period of time where it looked as if there was a significant Republican advantage to having undisclosed corporate money, which would create, it was thought, a Republican majority in the Senate. And so Republicans were pushed not to upset that apple cart and to deal with this issue after there was a Republican majority. Well, it didn't work out that way. So I think there are a couple factors at play. One is that to the extent that the argument was made that this secret spending would enable corporations to elect Republicans and that would be a magic silver bullet for Republicans, that didn't happen. So I think that partisan calculation now changes. Also, of course, on the Democratic side, a fair amount of secret money turned up, not as much, but I think, again, as Fred has said, once the spigot is open and people have discovered how to use it, you see the trickle grow. So it may be that we are in this arms race where both sides benefit from it, which means both sides also can step back without feeling they're the ones being hurt. You also have to remember that members of Congress are both members of Congress, members of their parties, and candidates. And I suspect for many of them, this scene in this election with hidden money coming in from nowhere at the very end of the election cycle is a disturbing one. Not that they can't fight opposition, but if they have no idea who's doing it and it's coming in at the last minute, they can't deal with it except by going into Congress now, into this next session, and raising even more money than they raised before, so that if this happens to them in their reelects, they will have an extra $1 million or $2 million sitting in their bank accounts to react with. And that just pushes the fundraising race beyond, I think, any human limits. The pressure to raise money has been enormous. This new outside spending by super PACs and non-disclosing groups just ratchets that up. And so I suspect you are going to see members of Congress, at least privately, wondering, is there anything to relieve some of that pressure? And if disclosure is helpful in that regard, I think they're going to find it appealing.
One more fact, if I could add it. I mentioned earlier that in the old soft money system, there was a tenfold increase over a 12-year period. By the time we got to 2000, the amount of unlimited contributions raised by the Democrats and the Republicans was almost even. That $500 million, there was a $3 or $4 million spread between Democrats and Republicans. So Republicans are not going to have the enormous advantage they have had in the first couple of elections over time. They may still have some advantage, but the Democrats are going to catch up, and they will have enough of this money on their side in coming elections.
Knowing we're at the National Press Club, I'm going to pose this question to the panelists. I know as a reporter it was very confusing after Citizens United and subsequent cases to try to cover this stuff. I want to ask your thoughts on the coverage of public money and the contributions that went towards these candidates this last cycle. Aside from Jonathan's wonderful reporting, did the press do a good job of finding the money, reporting it, and what could they have done better? Sheila?
Boy, I live and breathe this stuff, so I guess my view is different, but I thought that there was just so much coverage, and yet everyone was still coming to us with basic questions and confusion, well into the election. In fact, closing in on election day, there was still just a lot of misunderstanding about what is a super PAC, what can it do, what does it disclose, does it disclose effectively, that kind, so I was surprised that at least the basic tenets of the post-Citizens United era were not effectively absorbed. On the other hand, it's a complicated system, and you get a very clear sense of that by looking at the new rules that we posted under our outside spending section, unfortunately only just before the election, but we have if you're ever suffering from insomnia, try taking that on your iPad to bed, because it's just incredibly dense to have to go through all of the rules, who has to disclose when, why, how. So under outside spending on opensecrets.org, there's this new sheet called Rules of Disclosure that I think may be helpful, but really crystallizes how dense and complicated this really is.
Fred?
I agree with Sheila that there was a good deal of confusion, and understandably so, because this is very confusing, and the operatives and players don't exactly go out of their way to try to simplify it. However, having said that, in the 40 years that I've been working on this issue, this election by far had the most coverage of the campaign money flowing in the election that we have ever seen. The coverage was almost daily. There was an extraordinary amount of work done on this. The interesting challenge is going to be about what kind of coverage, continuing coverage, we have once we're out of the campaign cycle and into the governing cycle and Congress, because it's one thing to cover the flow of money in terms of their effect on elections and who's doing what and what campaigns are benefiting and not benefiting. It's another thing, and it's frankly a much harder task, to cover what is going on in Congress and relate it to what are now extraordinary amounts of money that are sloshing around in our political system.
Trevor, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think the press has done a good job at reporting what it can, which is the super PAC numbers and how much people are spending. I think there have been a range of storylines here, which are sort of the usual horse race ones, but then they're the horse race ones with the money on them. Romney has a huge quarter. Obama has a huge month. Obama's ads are cheaper. That means he has an advantage. Romney has more outside ads. That means he has an advantage. But I think that's because everyone's trying to make sense of numbers that are coming in and that only really after the election can you step back at and take a look at. The one thing I'd say is I think there hasn't been enough press attention to the important development that Jonathan mentions, which is the end of the presidential public funding system. It sort of went out with a whimper. It was discussed in 2008 when McCain was in it and Obama wasn't, and then it kind of went away and became maybe a process issue. And I think you see some reference to it, but it is worth looking at the effect of that. CBS has a number that says that President Obama did 222 fundraising events in this cycle, and another 120 campaign events. So twice as many virtually fundraisers, private fundraisers, with major donors as there were campaign events. That's one way to look at it, is to say he's spending a huge amount of time with a very small number of people. You probably all read that great New Yorker article about the care and feeding of Democratic donors and how they complained that he didn't spend enough time at their tables at dinners, and how when they came to see him in the Oval Office he didn't seem interested and so forth. You know, the assumption that the President of the United States' primary job should be to care about these major donors. And as a fundraiser, it may be his job. And if you're looking at 222 of them, that's a lot of time. You recall the Romney jab at Obama in the third debate that right after the Libyan crisis, instead of staying in Washington, he had jetted off to Las Vegas. Well, there's kind of a pregnant sentence there because he jetted off to a fundraiser, because that's what the incumbent president has to do. And if you go back and look at the Watergate era and the creation of the presidential public funding system, it was precisely because the Congress overwhelmingly felt that the incumbent president shouldn't be spending his time in either of two ways. Either spending a lot of time running around fundraising rather than doing their day and night job, or being closeted in rooms only with a tiny segment of the population. And both of those, I think, are what we now face in a world without a presidential public funding system. And it didn't do Romney any favors either. You'll notice in the middle of the campaign, again, just in reference reported, Romney said he would like to repair the public funding system, and he thought, actually, we should have one. People thought, well, gosh, that's out of left field. Well, it's not out of left field if you're spending all your time going to fundraisers with small groups of people instead of meeting voters. And a constant drumbeat from the Romney campaign is that they were spending a lot of time because they were broke trying to raise money in July, August, September, rather than doing major events. And then, of course, when you look at the famous 47% tape, it's a small fundraiser. If you're spending all that time with that group of people, you get in a groove of saying what they want to hear, and you start repeating what you've heard from them. So it doesn't do either of them favors. And that's a broader policy question that I think gets lost in the numbers.
Of course, the only way that anybody in California or Washington, D.C., or New York or Texas saw any of the candidates was when they had a fundraiser.
Well, that anybody is certainly a tiny, tiny segment of the population.
One fact to buttress Trevor's point, a lot of attention gets paid to the small donors that Obama raises contributions from, and it is very impressive. It's very important in the long term, because at least where I've come from, the internet may be the key to fundamentally changing this system in terms of the ability of involving tens of millions of Americans through small contributions. But what did not get much attention was the fact that President Obama had well over 100 bundlers, each of whom raised at least $500,000 for him. Now, if I raise $500,000 for a candidate, it's no different than if I gave $500,000 to a candidate, because the candidate doesn't care whether the money's coming out of my pocket or it's coming from other people. I'm responsible for $500,000, and that potentially buys me $500,000 worth of influence. If we were seeing stories in the course of the election of Obama or Romney receiving $500,000 contributions, that would be somewhat astonishing to people, and they would have the same kind of reaction to it as all of the money that Sheldon Adelson spread around. But we didn't get that much attention paid to those bundlers. Those bundlers should be very carefully watched when over the next 4 years in terms of public policy. But I just buttressed Trevor's point that there were some areas that really did not receive that much attention that are very important, particularly in the future.
I will point out that my home state of Utah was essentially an ATM for Mitt Romney this last time, and it worked out very well. Back to the audience. Any questions? Front row here. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Could you identify yourself?
Thank you. I wonder if you guys could talk a little more about what's next, both on the Hill and where you think this is all heading.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think one interesting thing that we haven't really discussed is how important it is, I think, based upon the results of this election, for candidates to have money, whether it's in their own coffers or in a super PAC, to defend themselves. I think that was one of the big lessons of this cycle, is that you cannot leave an attack unanswered. And my sense from news reports is that that is what the consensus is in terms of the attacks on Romney and linking him to ruthless behavior, quote unquote ruthless behavior by Bain, particularly with the ad called Stage, where the guy said, when I built the stage, I felt like I was building my coffin. So to not have sufficient funds to be able to address those attacks from left field, I think must be a sobering thought for all candidates planning election runs in 2014 and beyond.
I would say where we're headed is to corruption and scandal. You cannot have this kind of money floating around in the political system without it ending up buying influence. And as I said earlier, this is just the beginning. And there will be scandals that come out of this election and future elections with these huge unlimited contributions until we do something about it. On the legislative front, there are probably three main areas that people are working on. The most immediate and front burner is disclosure. That has always been a baseline of campaign finance laws, so citizens can know what is going on. And I mentioned that a little earlier. The second area is some form of repair to the presidential system and creating a new congressional system. And I think the main focus will be on the multiple matching funds approach. And we are hopeful that that out of the bills that are pending up there, we can end up with one bill to organize around. From the time that the focus of campaign finance reform became McCain-Feingold in 1997, it took basically almost more than 5 years to enact that. And I think there's a reasonably good chance that we will come up with one vehicle that is a combination, that will have matching funds, multiple matching funds for smaller contributions. And we'll also have efforts to curb super PACs as best we can. The third area is the area of the constitutional amendment. There's a number of constitutional amendments that have been introduced, and I think an effort will be made by the people who are working in that area also to come up with one approach. Our organization focuses on the first two areas, disclosure and public financing. It's interesting that the president will give his inauguration speech this year on both Martin Luther King's anniversary and the third anniversary of the Citizens United decision. So I think you can expect some attention paid to what needs to be done to those two areas, probably more so to the whole question of voting than the campaign finance area.
A little less than 15 minutes to go. There was another question in the middle of the audience there, sir. Please identify yourself.
Richard Mullins. My question is related to the one that you posed to the group. Now that Citizens United has created this species that's at the dominant part of the evolutionary chain for outside money, what work remains to be done by research, by cleverness, looking at 990s to occasionally pierce the veil, find a gap in it, get to the disclosure that has been so carefully structured that we don't get?
Sheila, your group does that.
We do that, but I think to get beyond the relatively minor portion that even if we had as much labor available to mine those reports, to get at the portion beyond that, I think would require action by Congress. Again, even if we had infinite resources, what we would hope to capture through what is now being reported is still the tip of the iceberg. I think the best hope here is to me, seemingly obvious duplicity and deceit of the shell corporations that say, I'm not going to tell you where this money came from, I don't have to, and the 501c organizations that are so evidently political in nature, primarily political in nature, while using the 501c tax exempt status to skirt under the disclosure rules. I mean, that to me seems like a big black eye to democracy, something that people of, left, right, and center could organize around, that groups could organize support for reform. So it seems to me that there is a ripe opportunity for common ground among kind of across the ideological spectrum for reform. But as we all know, even smartly, narrowly tailored reforms can have unintended consequences. So of course, that is going to have to be there's going to have to be a serious conversation about this. Hopefully, it's not so arcane that people will, snooze.
There's also the growing effort to try to get companies to disclose from the shareholder perspective, both the SEC and groups, I said, like the Center for Political Accountability. So if you connect the dots, Company A gives to this trade association, it gives to this group. And I said some of the trade associations do report their donations on their 990 forms. And there's also the Federal Election Commission that Trevor had mentioned. 5 of the 6 commissioners are serving on unexpired terms. There's been a big effort on the part of the reform community to try to pressure President Obama into making that a priority. He's got 4 years. Does he pick a fight with the Senate Republicans over it? He has a recess appointment power that he could conceivably nominate people if they're held up in the Senate during a recess appointment, appoint activists who want to change. It can't be more than 3 of one party, but there are Republicans like Trevor who support more robust campaign finance regulation, and President Obama is going to the mat. That's a way to find out what happens and a way to see if there can be more, FEC, more robust disclosure.
A big part of this problem of disclosure stems from the failure of the IRS to properly interpret and enforce the nonprofit regulations. Our organization and Trevor's organization have sent 10 letters to the IRS over the last 2 years, beginning in October of 2010, challenging a number of groups claiming C4 status as being not entitled to C4 status, including Crossroads GPS, the Karl Rove Group, and Priorities USA, the group supporting President Obama. We also filed a petition for rulemaking to ask the IRS to review its rules and fix them, because they are contrary not only to the statute but to court decisions. We did get a letter from the IRS this past summer informing us, and I didn't know this, that the regulations that govern this area are more than a half-century old to begin with. So they were adopted at a time that had absolutely no sense of this kind of issue. They said they would consider changing the rules, but they just issued their priority guidance for the coming year of all the things they're going to be working on, and this was not one of them. So we've asked for a meeting with the IRS. We have also off and on explored, and will continue to explore, whether we can sue the IRS to challenge their regulations, because they clearly do not effectively enforce the statute. And even with these lax regulations, we believe that groups like Crossroads GPS and Priorities USA and some others are not entitled to C4 status. Now, Crossroads GPS has never been granted C4 status as far as we know. I mean, the last we saw was a statement that had an application pending. So we have no idea what's going on inside the IRS, and they do not tell you.
So I think my summary of the answer would be, you have at a important but sort of daily level, this whole series of activities that have just been listed, whether it's the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS, the possibilities at the FEC, somewhere around there, there's presumably still floating the possibility of an executive order on government contractors having to disclose. There are a whole range of ways, aside from congressional action, which I also think is a possibility. So all of those deal with the immediate issues of disclosure, of all this coordinated activity occurring when it's supposed to be non-coordinated, et cetera. Then I think you have a whole separate level, which is a longer discussion, meaning it's not going to be this year, I think, or next, which is how do we want to fund our elections? And have we ended up in a place we don't want to be as a country? What about going back to public funding? And if we believe in those values, should they be extended? I think that's a different conversation, but one that is going to come from what happened this year, and what I agree will be greater, without changes, greater spending and greater secret spending and greater opportunities for corruption in a midterm.
Speaking of building on your question, in the last few minutes we have, let me just be blunt here. Is it going to take another Watergate for something to happen with public finance laws? Obviously, the FEC isn't doing anything right now. The Congress may or may not. But will it take another big scandal with public money for something to actually get done?
Scandals help. They are central to changing the system. I don't know that we need a Watergate scandal. I think one of those every century is enough. And I think, while the last one was in the last century, it's still close enough on a calendar year basis. But, you know, look, there was a lot of work done on McCain-Feingold for years that built support, and the last chip that came along was the Enron scandal, which involved a lot of soft money. So I do think we will need scandals, not the Watergate level, and I do think we'll have scandals.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say Enron too, and for a slightly different reason, which is it was somewhat unpredictable that Enron would be what pushed McCain-Feingold over the finish line. Enron was not a campaign finance scandal. It was an internal accounting scandal. But what happened was you had this perceived major player and soft money donor that suddenly went south, and everybody saw it as a symbol of what was wrong with the whole system of influence in Washington. And the bill to deal with influence in Washington was McCain-Feingold in Congress. So I don't think you can predict the nature of the scandal or what people will believe pushes us into doing something about all these issues.
Well, also, lawmakers may just get tired of having to deal with all these attack ads. They don't know where it's coming from. We saw in 2011, 2012, some lawmakers who were targeted in 2010 and survived, raising a lot more money early. They couldn't coast even if they were in a safe district. And some of these lawmakers, we have freshmen who are setting up leadership PACs now. They can't spend the money on their campaigns, but they can spend it on political activity. And they haven't even been sworn into office yet. So sometimes some of the lawmakers just may get tired of the money chase and say, there's got to be a better way. I don't want to start raising $1 zillion January 3rd after I put my hand on the Bible, because I'm afraid that 12 months from now, some anonymous millionaire is going to run $1 million worth of attack ads against me.
On that note, I've talked to several donors, obviously, who would like to have this closed off too, because they're tired of giving and giving and giving.
I think what Trevor and Jonathan just said is a very important factor. Members do not like what's going on. They're scared of this system. It forces them to spend more and more time raising this money. Now, the parties start out in different places on how do you deal with this. But there's no question that members getting tired of this or afraid of it is going to be a factor down the road in changing this system. There's a simple formula here about campaign finance laws, and it's the following. Campaign finance reform is simply impossible until it happens. It's always viewed as something that's too hard to do, that you can't do, and yet it has happened in the past at very important moments, and it will happen again. So I would discount all the arguments that say nothing can be done, because we've done it before and we will do it again.
And I would add to that, to distill sort of the comments. First, I think if you had a closed vote or poll of members, both sides would say they do not like the system. I agree with Fred, they don't have common answers yet, but they don't like where they are. They don't like the corrupting potentials, the lobbying issues, the amount of money they have to raise as a result. They're simply uncomfortable with it. So it's not a bad place to start when both sides don't like the status quo. And secondly, I think after this election, there is a sense that the perceived great Republican advantage of having all this outside money didn't, in fact, produce the expected results. And whatever the reasons for that are, or however that might change in the future, I think that affects the discussion as well, because it means, you know, that neither side thinks that they have to have the system we have to achieve victory, and so that opens up the possibility for changes.
A perfect summation of the panel today. I want to thank everyone on behalf of the National Press Club, Journalism Institute, the Professional Development Committee, Sheila Krumholz, so appreciate it, Jonathan Salant, Trevor Potter, Fred Wertheimer. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. It's nice to see you again. Yeah. And I can see your next appearance.